One, can you share a bit about your background and what brought you to pursue your line of work?
Okay, I am part Cree and part Soto. My mom was a fluent Cree speaker when she went to residential school, and my dad was a fluent Soto speaker when he went to residential school. I'm the third generation residential school survivor. So my parents went to residential school, and I went to residential school. So by the time I graduated from residential school, I could not speak my language. Language had already been lost in my family. So, but my mom and my dad, they could understand their language, but they no longer spoke it. So when I graduated from grade 12, I left with the intent that I would never walk into a school again, because the experience for me wasn't the positive experience. So what motivated me to become a teacher was when I was going to have my daughter Sarah. And that's what motivated me to go back to school and to have a good attitude and to be helpful to her. And I remember thinking when I was going to school how I wished there was Indigenous teachers or elders or somebody that I could talk to when I was at school. I remember thinking that and wishing that so much. So when I decided to go to university, the school counselor talked me into taking up the teacher program. And that's how I got into being a teacher. I thought, well, maybe I would be helpful for other young Indigenous people who, like me, wish that there was somebody Indigenous that they could relate to or talk to. So that's how I became a teacher.
How would you describe what you do and what your role is as a role model for Indigenous people?
Okay, so what I do right now is I'm an elementary school teacher, and that's what I've been all my years. I feel I'm a role model, a positive role model for other Indigenous youth at the school and in the community. I think I remind them of their own cookums, their own grandparents, and I'm a connection for them, because I make a point of always trying to bring Indigenous culture into the classroom and making sure that what the students learn about Indigenous people is true and positive, because we've gone through so much negative experiences. There's so much stereotypes that it was really important for me to make sure that my students were learning the real history and learning about our culture in a positive manner and with the truth.
From your perspective, what are the most significant changes you've seen in the Indigenous education in Saskatchewan's provincial system over the past few years?
For me, the biggest change is that the teaching of treaties is mandated in Saskatchewan. The other thing too is Indigenous resources, like Indigenous authored books. In my time, that didn't exist at all. There was no Indigenous authored books that we read. We didn't learn about treaties. So for me, those are the biggest steps forward to improve education for Indigenous people. Those are the big ones. Yeah.
What challenges still exist when it comes to integrating Indigenous knowledge and perspective into classrooms?
Okay, well, I would have to say that the biggest challenge probably would be racism. I think that racism is still a challenge for our Indigenous youth in schools. And also as Indigenous teachers and Indigenous staff people, we have to deal with people's stereotypes and bias. So that's a challenge for us, is learning how to cope with that and still graduate from school. Like, to us, I think that is the biggest challenge. And I think with truth and reconciliation, and that's what we're moving towards in our school division, and we're actively working on that, that is going to heal that relationship between First Nations and non-First Nations people. But I do believe for sure racism is something our Indigenous young people have to deal with, especially at the middle years and the high school level.
How do you incorporate Soto and Cree culture or language into your teaching?
Well, you know what? It's so important. At my age, I am relearning my language that was taken from my family. And so this year, through the sprints that I've been participating with, I've been helping my students learn basic readings in Cree and Soto from the people of the Treaty 6 territory. And as they're learning, I'm learning as well. At one time, I had speakers in my family that I could talk and ask, like my Auntie Movino, my Auntie Myrtle, they were fluent Soto speakers. You know, everybody's resilient as to how they keep their language. They went to residential school, but they kept on speaking their language. And so I used to be able to call them up and ask them, you know, but now I can't because they moved on. And so for me, it's really important that whatever resources I use come from this territory, from Saskatchewan. And I'm always trying to find or meet people who still speak the language that I could talk to as to help build my own background in language. The other thing too is we started this year too is including basic language, basic vocabulary as part of our monthly morning daily announcements here at the school. And we use some language apps that we discovered at the school here to help us with that. And they were developed by speakers from this area, from Saskatchewan. And also, you know, learning how to sing happy birthday in Cree. Like my students can sing happy birthday in Cree really well. And they can speak the Soto greetings really well. They can, so that to me is a positive move towards language. I think language is so important to identity. And I think that's something we need to work towards in our whole school system, province-wide, is starting to teach language.
What are your hopes for the future of Indigenous education in the provincial system?
So that would have to be language. I really believe if we want to teach truth and reconciliation and for Indigenous youth to regain their identity, learn their identity, language is essential. I think that's so important. It's been taken from us, and that's something that I think the provincial school system should work with First Nations towards reteaching language, giving our language back to us, making it a part of our schools, and not just to Indigenous students. Non-Indigenous students could benefit from learning Indigenous languages too.
How could they benefit from that? Like, what's the benefits of that?
Because it would help them to learn a different worldview. Mm-hmm. See, language is where you learn worldview. And I think that would be open a lot of doors to helping students, both First Nation and non-First Nation, to understand each other, because within the language is worldview. And I think that's so important.
If you could make one change tomorrow to improve education for Indigenous students, what would it be?
If I could make one change for tomorrow, it would be if we could have an elder in this school, and that there was an elder who was a language speaker here in this school that we could all get guidance from for the language. And somebody who could take our kids out on the land and teach them our cultural ways and teach non-Indigenous students the First Nation cultural ways on the land and to connect with the land.
Is there anything else you think is important to mention that hasn't already been mentioned?
I think that with truth and reconciliation, when I talk about how Indigenous languages is so important and on the land learning is so important, I think it's important for Indigenous and non-Indigenous to learn this together, because for the last 3 generations, we've been kept separate. Our learning systems have been separate. Indigenous children learned in residential schools. Well, learned to survive in residential schools. Non-Indigenous children went to the public schools, and what they learned about us wasn't the truth. They learned a whole bunch of lies and stereotypes about Indigenous people. So towards truth and reconciliation, I think when we learn language, I think it's important that the non-Indigenous learn along with the Indigenous students language, because worldview and the teachings and the respect in the language and learning how to look at things in with a different lens is so important to building a good relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
And
Yeah.
just one last thing that I didn't have in here. What does truth and reconciliation mean, and what does it mean specifically to you?
Okay, to me, the truth part of truth and reconciliation is teaching the actual true history of the relations between the newcomers and the Indigenous people here on this land. I think, to me, that's the truth, learning the true history, breaking down stereotypes with the truth. The reconciliation part is, to me, is about building positive, good relationships between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I mean, that's what truth and reconciliation is. And it's not about just saying sorry, but it's action, taking action towards improving and building a good relationship. Going back to that treaty relationship when they were first negotiated. To me, that's what truth and reconciliation is about. And for me, that's really important because my family, myself, we've experienced how the treaties have been broken with the residential schools and how we've been healing. And I know what it's like to deal with racism, and so I know it can be very challenging for our young people. For us, it's just surviving, sometimes just surviving at home without having to also deal with other people's racist views towards us.
Do you have any message that you would want to give to an Indigenous youth who is going through schools and stuff like that today?
My message is, do your best. Don't give up. You come from a strong people who persevered, who never gave up. That's how we survived here on this land, where you come from a very smart people. And I would say just continue to try your best and never give up, because you can do it.